September 1943, southern Italy. The air is thick with smoke and the sound of distant artillery. Italian soldiers, once part of the fascist army, stand in stunned silence, gazing at the American engineers before them. The once proud, uniformed ranks of the Italian military now find themselves in a strange, unspoken alliance. These soldiers, who had fought against the very forces now before them, are confronted by a realization that defies their wartime beliefs. They can help. The Americans, engineers by trade, are here for a different kind of battle, one of infrastructure and survival. They need local knowledge, and the Italian soldiers, weary from months of fighting, can offer it. The idea seems almost absurd, but in the reality of war, where shifting allegiances and survival often take precedence, the boundary between enemy and ally becomes blurred. As the Italian soldiers stand alongside the Americans, a moment of understanding passes between them. No longer just enemies, they are men bound by the same war, with the same desires for survival, each now facing the same uncertain future. By 1943, Italy had already been engaged in a devastating war for over 4 years. As a member of the Axis powers, Italy had aligned itself with Nazi Germany, engaging in military campaigns alongside Hitler's forces across North Africa and the Balkans. The Italian military, under Mussolini's fascist regime, initially found some early successes, but was soon overwhelmed by strategic miscalculations and the sheer force of the Allied offensive. The Italian army, which had once been a proud symbol of fascist strength, was increasingly showing signs of disarray. Mussolini's leadership was now questioned by many, as his decisions, like the disastrous invasion of Greece and the subsequent failures in North Africa, had left Italy vulnerable. The turning point came in July 1943, when Allied forces launched a successful invasion of Sicily, marking the beginning of the end for Mussolini's regime. The invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, not only marked a critical military defeat, but set the stage for Italy's surrender. As the Allies advanced through Sicily and into mainland Italy, Mussolini's grip on power began to unravel. On the 25th of July 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism voted to depose Mussolini, and he was arrested by the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III. The country, once firmly in the hands of Mussolini and the fascists, was now at a crossroads. The new Italian government, led by King Victor Emmanuel, sought an armistice with the Allies, but the war was far from over. On the 8th of September 1943, Italy formally surrendered to the Allies. The Armistice of Cassibile effectively ended Italy's role in the Axis war effort. However, the surrender did not bring peace. Instead, it caused a division within the country. Mussolini, rescued by German forces, was placed at the head of the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy, a puppet regime backed by Hitler. Meanwhile, the southern half of the country, now under Allied control, began to reorganize its military forces to fight alongside the Allies. This split between the two Italian factions, those loyal to Mussolini and those who had switched sides, created an atmosphere of confusion, fear, and distrust. For the ordinary Italian soldier, the war had become more about survival than loyalty. Italian soldiers, many of whom had been conscripted into Mussolini's army, found themselves suddenly on the losing side, with no clear direction or purpose. As German forces entrenched themselves in northern Italy, the country was effectively torn in two. In the south, the newly formed co-belligerent army, made up of former Italian soldiers who had defected to the Allied cause, began to work alongside the American and British forces. However, for the Italian soldier who had once fought for Mussolini, the transition was not easy. Many still viewed the Allied forces with suspicion, and the stigma of being labelled a traitor by their fellow countrymen hung heavily. But the harsh reality of war quickly set in. Survival had become more important than any allegiance. As Italy surrendered in September 1943, the Allied forces now faced the complex task of pushing through Italy, a country that was strategically vital but difficult to navigate due to its mountainous terrain and heavily fortified defences. The Allies needed to secure key infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and supply lines, to advance further into Europe. But much of the infrastructure in southern Italy had been destroyed or heavily damaged during the German retreat and the Italian surrender. Enter the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a group of soldiers specializing in the construction, demolition, and maintenance of vital infrastructure. These engineers were tasked with rapidly repairing roads, bridges, and airstrips to ensure the success of the Allied invasion of Italy and the subsequent campaign. The engineers were, in essence, the lifeblood of the Allied advance, allowing supplies, reinforcements, and critical material to reach the front lines as the battle for Italy continued. However, the engineers were often faced with a significant challenge: lack of local knowledge. Despite their skill and expertise, the engineers were working in unfamiliar terrain, without a clear understanding of the local infrastructure and the difficulties that came with navigating Italy's rugged landscape. This is where the Italian soldiers, now part of the co-belligerent army, could be of assistance. As Allied forces advanced, many Italian soldiers found themselves caught between two worlds. They had fought for Mussolini's regime, but now, in the face of defeat, many of them were eager to help the Allies and contribute to the war effort. The American engineers, recognizing the need for local expertise, began to forge relationships with the Italian soldiers. It was a partnership that was born out of necessity rather than ideology, but it was one that would prove invaluable to the success of the campaign. Initially, the Italian soldiers were stunned by the idea of helping the very forces they had once fought against. Some were skeptical, unsure whether to trust the Americans. But, as the war dragged on, and with German forces still holding parts of northern Italy, survival became a priority. The realization slowly set in that they could no longer fight for Mussolini, and now they had an opportunity to help rebuild their country by assisting the Americans. The Italian soldiers' knowledge of local geography, road networks, and even the locations of German defensive positions became crucial for the U.S. engineers. These soldiers, many of whom had spent years traversing the countryside, knew the terrain better than any foreign engineer could. They could direct engineers to hidden roads, guide them to broken bridges that needed repair, and provide invaluable assistance in navigating Italy's labyrinthine infrastructure. What had begun as a reluctant alliance slowly turned into a mutual respect. Italian soldiers, who had once been proud of their military prowess under Mussolini's regime, now found a sense of purpose in helping the Allies. For the Americans, the collaboration was not only about strategic gain but also about creating a bond between the former enemy soldiers and the new Italian government that was emerging in the South. This unexpected cooperation, while born out of the need to survive and rebuild, marked a moment of profound human resilience and adaptability. It was a lesson in pragmatism, where the harsh realities of war pushed soldiers from opposite sides to work together for a common goal: to ensure the defeat of the German forces and to secure Italy's future. The work of the U.S. engineers, now aided by former Italian soldiers, was instrumental in the Allied advance through Italy. The repairs to strategic bridges and supply routes allowed the Allies to continue their push north, culminating in the eventual liberation of the entire country. This cooperation also paved the way for future operations in Europe, demonstrating how even in the most fractured wartime environments, cooperation born of necessity could still play a crucial role in achieving victory. For the Italian soldiers, the transition from being soldiers of Mussolini's fascist regime to working alongside the very Allied forces they had once fought against was a profound and often bewildering experience. Many of these soldiers had been conscripted into the army, with little choice in the matter. The brutality of Mussolini's regime had left them with little room for dissent. They fought in campaigns that they did not necessarily believe in, under a government that had promised glory but delivered defeat. By 1943, many of these soldiers were disillusioned, facing not just the collapse of their government, but the very real threat of death or captivity. When Italy formally surrendered to the Allies in September 1943, the Italian soldiers found themselves stranded between two worlds. On one hand, they were still technically part of the Axis as the Italian Social Republic, headed by Mussolini, took control of the northern part of the country with German support. On the other hand, the southern half of Italy, now under Allied control, began to reorganize its forces to fight against the Germans and their former fascist allies. These soldiers found themselves caught in the middle, no longer loyal to Mussolini's regime, but not yet fully accepted by the Allies. In this climate of confusion, the American engineers arrived, needing assistance with the rebuilding of critical infrastructure. The idea of former Italian soldiers helping U.S. engineers would have been unfathomable just months earlier. But for the soldiers now struggling to make sense of the chaos around them, survival was paramount. The willingness to cooperate with the Americans was not necessarily born from an ideological shift, but from a pragmatic decision to find a way forward, however uncertain that path might be. For many of these Italian soldiers, the moment of realization that they could help the Americans was both a shock and a relief. The mental shift from enemy to ally wasn't instantaneous, nor was it easy. Some soldiers initially feared retribution from their fellow countrymen, those who still fought for Mussolini or who held loyalist views toward fascism. In fact, many faced hostility from their own people for choosing to work with the Allies. There was a stigma attached to being a traitor in a country torn by civil conflict and ideological divisions. Yet, as the days turned to weeks and the Allied presence in southern Italy grew, the Italian soldiers began to see the reality of their situation. The war had changed. Mussolini's regime was a relic of the past, and Germany was now the true enemy. The Germans, once seen as the allies of Italy, were now seen as occupiers, and many Italians began to resent their presence. This emotional shift was not easy for the soldiers, who had once been indoctrinated into a nationalistic ideology. However, as the realities of war set in hunger, destruction, and death, a more practical desire emerged: survival. The idea of working alongside the Americans was not just a practical necessity. It represented the chance for these soldiers to reclaim their dignity and rebuild their country. They could no longer fight for Mussolini, but they could fight against the Germans by helping the Allies. It was, in many ways, a reclaiming of agency for men who had been caught in a war they never fully understood. These Italian soldiers were not necessarily motivated by a sudden love for democracy or Allied ideals. Instead, they were driven by a desire to survive and protect their homes from further destruction. For the U.S. engineers, working alongside these Italian soldiers was a strange but necessary collaboration. While the engineers had their mission to repair bridges, roads, and airstrips, they had not expected to find themselves working side by side with the former enemy. For them, the cooperation was an unexpected, though welcome, turn of events. The American soldiers were often surprised by the helpfulness and expertise of the Italian soldiers. The Italians, who knew the land better than any American engineer could, offered invaluable knowledge about local infrastructure roads that had been damaged by German forces, hidden routes that bypassed dangerous zones, and local supply networks that could be repaired and repurposed. This collaboration was, for many of the American engineers, a moment of human connection in an otherwise brutal war. The Allies had once been enemies of the Axis powers, but here, in the Italian countryside, the lines of allegiance had blurred. The engineers, initially skeptical of working with the Italians, began to see them not as enemies, but as fellow soldiers, caught in a larger conflict than they had ever chosen to be part of. The emotional weight of this new alliance was significant for both sides. For the Italians, it was a painful but necessary step toward redemption. For the Americans, it was an example of how war, in all its brutality, could still allow for moments of cooperation and understanding between former enemies. In the end, the bond between the Italian soldiers and the American engineers was born out of shared suffering and the desperate need to rebuild and survive. As the Allied forces advanced through Italy, one of the critical challenges they faced was the destruction of infrastructure. The Italians, in collaboration with the retreating German forces, had made sure that much of the country's roads, bridges, and airstrips were either destroyed or rendered unusable. The Allied engineers tasked with repairing and rebuilding these vital structures found themselves struggling to make headway in an unfamiliar environment, with limited knowledge of local geography and infrastructure. This is where the unexpected cooperation between the Italian soldiers and the US Army engineers became a game-changer. The Italian soldiers, now part of the co-belligerent army, had first-hand knowledge of the region's topography, existing infrastructure, and hidden routes that had been used by both the Axis and resistance forces. Their local expertise turned out to be an invaluable asset to the American engineers, who were unfamiliar with the terrain and often lacked the precise knowledge necessary to repair damaged infrastructure quickly and efficiently. In the mountainous and difficult terrain of southern Italy, local knowledge became a critical advantage. For example, Italian soldiers could guide the engineers to alternate routes that bypassed German-held territories, enabling the Allies to maintain their momentum and avoid heavily fortified positions. Many Italian soldiers had spent years navigating these landscapes, whether as part of Mussolini's military or as civilians, and understood the land in ways that American engineers could not replicate without significant time and effort. Furthermore, the Italian soldiers' familiarity with the local infrastructure helped the US engineers identify what could be salvaged and what needed to be replaced entirely. For instance, in Salerno and Anzio, Italian soldiers led US engineers to local bridges that had been partially damaged but could be repaired with minimal effort, saving valuable time. The American engineers were initially focused on rebuilding from scratch, but the Italian soldiers' experience allowed them to assess whether existing structures could be reinforced or rebuilt, thus conserving precious resources and manpower. Perhaps the most critical role that Italian soldiers played was in the repair of critical bridges that were essential for the Allied supply lines. In southern Italy, where the Germans had destroyed many bridges during their retreat, the American engineers were tasked with not only rebuilding bridges, but also establishing new routes that would allow for the rapid movement of troops and supplies. Italian soldiers, who knew the existing river crossings and bridge structures, were able to provide US engineers with key insights into where to focus their efforts. In the aftermath of Operation Avalanche, the Allied landings at Salerno, the need for quick mobility was critical. As American forces pushed forward, US engineers needed to repair and rebuild roads and airfields that would allow them to sustain their momentum. In the chaos of the battlefield, American engineers relied on Italian soldiers to offer not just local knowledge of roads and routes, but also practical help in reconstructing vital infrastructure under fire. The Italian soldiers themselves were often the first to volunteer to help, not only out of necessity, but also because many had become disillusioned with the war. They had experienced the horror of combat and the weight of Mussolini's failed fascist ideology. Working alongside American engineers, many of these soldiers sought redemption by helping rebuild the country they had once fought for. They understood the urgency of the mission and provided the engineers with much-needed guidance on local resources and methods of repair that might otherwise have been overlooked. In one particularly pivotal instance, as Allied forces approached the Gulf of Naples, the engineers were tasked with repairing a bridge that had been partially destroyed by German forces during their retreat. The task seemed impossible due to the extent of the damage, but the local knowledge of the Italian soldiers, who knew that the original bridge had a subterranean route that could be used for support, made it possible to restore the crossing. Without this local insight, the engineers would have had to go through the difficult process of constructing an entirely new bridge, a delay that could have been disastrous in the midst of a rapidly advancing battlefield. The tactical advantage of this collaboration was clear. By working with local soldiers, the US engineers were able to expedite repairs, increase the efficiency of their operations, and avoid unnecessary delays. In the final months of the Italian campaign, when time was of the essence, this cooperation ensured that vital routes were opened up quickly, allowing for the sustained advance of Allied forces across Italy. As the war dragged on, The bond between the Italian soldiers and US engineers grew stronger. The engineers not only relied on their local expertise, but also came to appreciate the practical knowledge and resourcefulness of the Italian soldiers. This cooperation became a tactical advantage that contributed to the Allied victory in Italy and set the stage for the final push into northern Europe. While this partnership may have been born out of necessity, it became a symbol of how war could bring unexpected alliances that helped reshape the battlefield. It is September 1943. The southern Italian coast lies in the grip of war. US engineers are fighting a different kind of battle, one to repair and rebuild the infrastructure of a country torn apart by war. These engineers are crucial to the Allied campaign, but they are operating in a landscape that is foreign, hostile, and filled with the remnants of destruction. Roads are torn up, bridges are down, and airstrips are useless. For the engineers, these challenges are compounded by a lack of local knowledge. This is territory they are unfamiliar with. As Allied forces move further into Italy, it becomes clear that local expertise is essential. The engineers have a mission to accomplish, but they cannot do it alone. This is where the Italian soldiers, now caught between the remnants of Mussolini's fascist government and the new Allied cause, come into play. As part of the co-belligerent army, many of these soldiers, disillusioned and desperate, find themselves facing a new reality. They can help rebuild what their country had lost in war. It's an awkward, unexpected collaboration. The engineers whose job is to repair bridges, build roads, and ensure that Allied supply lines remain intact are now faced with the challenge of working with Italian soldiers who have only recently been their enemies. The soldiers, who had once fought against the Allies, now stand beside them with one common goal: defeating the Germans and reclaiming their country. The moment this partnership truly begins is in the wake of the Salerno landings in September 1943. Operation Avalanche was a successful Allied amphibious assault that placed US forces on the southern coast of Italy. But the success of the operation was not without challenges. German forces had fortified the area, and the Allied forces found themselves in a race against time to secure their foothold. The U.S. engineers, tasked with rapidly rebuilding damaged infrastructure, were key to ensuring the Allies could maintain their momentum. At the same time, the Italian soldiers, having witnessed the collapse of Mussolini's fascist regime, were grappling with their place in this new world order. They had no allegiance to Mussolini anymore. Many were now looking to the future, one where they could help rebuild what had been lost, especially as German forces continued to occupy the northern part of Italy. This marked a critical turning point. In the aftermath of the Italian surrender, the soldiers were now faced with an unexpected opportunity to assist the Americans in their operations, rather than resist them. The first real test of this cooperation comes when an American convoy approaches a strategic bridge that had been blown by the retreating Germans. The engineers need to quickly rebuild it to allow the movement of critical supplies to the front lines, but the engineers, unfamiliar with the area, are slowed down by the lack of local knowledge. It is then that Italian soldiers, familiar with the terrain, step forward. They know the land better than the Americans could have imagined. They suggest a temporary solution, pointing out an old, undamaged subterranean route that could bypass the destroyed bridge and allow the Allies to continue moving forward. At first, the engineers hesitate. Could they trust these former enemies, many of whom had fought against them just months earlier? But necessity breeds cooperation. The engineers take the advice, and the Italian soldiers help guide them through the network of routes. It's a small but pivotal moment, a simple exchange of knowledge that allows the engineers to complete their mission and keep the Allies moving. This moment of cooperation sets the tone for what will follow. These soldiers, once enemies, will become essential partners in the success of the Allied operations in Italy. As Allied forces continued their advance, this collaboration grew. In subsequent months, Italian soldiers became integral to the US engineers' efforts in the Italian campaign. The landscape of Italy, often jagged, difficult to navigate, and strategically important was now more accessible because of the combined knowledge of the engineers and the Italian soldiers. The shared effort in rebuilding bridges, clearing roads, and reinforcing supply lines became a crucial part of the Allied success. The engineers, recognizing the importance of the local knowledge the Italian soldiers brought, began to forge a deeper relationship with the former soldiers. In turn, many Italian soldiers found themselves proud to be part of this effort. No longer simply fighting for an ideology they no longer believed in, they were now contributing to the reconstruction of their homeland, working side by side with the Americans to secure a future free from the occupation of both the Germans and fascism. What began as a reluctant alliance between former enemies soon blossomed into a partnership built on necessity, but also on a shared desire to rebuild and defeat the common enemy. It was a unique and pivotal moment in the war, one where cooperation, despite the scars of the past, became the key to survival and success. As the Allied forces pushed further north into Italy, Italian soldiers now working alongside US engineers became pivotal in the success of key military operations. This unprecedented cooperation, born from necessity, turned into a tactical advantage that helped ensure the Allied advance was not hindered by the destruction left by the Germans. The combination of local knowledge and engineering expertise allowed the Allies to rebuild rapidly and maintain momentum, which proved crucial as the Italian campaign progressed. One of the most significant moments of cooperation came during the Salerno landings, Operation Avalanche, a critical point in the Allied invasion of Italy. After the initial success of the landings, the US engineers faced a daunting challenge. They needed to repair and clear roads, rebuild bridges, and re-establish communication lines to ensure the steady movement of troops and supplies. The Italians, familiar with the terrain and the infrastructure, provided critical assistance. At the Amalfi coast, where the Germans had heavily fortified positions, engineers and Italian soldiers worked together to clear debris from roads that were essential for the supply of reinforcements. It was not just the physical labor that the Italians offered, it was the local expertise in navigating the complex geography of the region. For instance, as the Allies sought to move reinforcements towards Naples and beyond, the Italian soldiers pointed out hidden routes and bypasses that the US engineers had not identified. This local knowledge allowed the Allies to avoid heavy resistance and German roadblocks. In areas where bridges had been destroyed, the Italian soldiers helped engineers by showing them locations of previous crossings, some of which could be repaired quickly, saving crucial time. Local Italian knowledge of minor river crossings, which had been used by both Italian and German forces during the occupation, became essential in maintaining supply lines. The success of Operation Avalanche was greatly aided by this Italian-American cooperation. As the engineers worked tirelessly to rebuild, the Italian soldiers who had once fought for Mussolini now worked alongside the Americans to ensure that Allied forces could advance without being bogged down by destroyed infrastructure. The Italians were able to move with precision, understanding where repairs were most needed and where roads could be reinforced quickly. Their familiarity with the landscape and pre-war infrastructure made them indispensable to the engineers. The value of this collaboration became even clearer during Operation Shingle at Anzio in January 1944. As the Allied forces landed at Anzio, they encountered fierce resistance from the German defenders, who had fortified the area. US engineers, supported by Italian soldiers, were tasked with rebuilding a network of bridges, airstrips, and supply roads to ensure the success of the operation. At Anzio, where the Allies faced fierce German opposition, the local knowledge provided by the Italians helped the engineers find alternate routes and hidden positions for defensive emplacements. The cooperation was a force multiplier. The Italians knew the layout of the towns and fortified positions better than anyone, and they helped the Americans avoid areas of heavy German fortifications. One of the most memorable examples of Italian assistance occurred when the Italian soldiers, familiar with the land, identified a key supply route leading to a vital bridge in the region. The US engineers, unaware of the terrain's nuances, were able to expedite repairs thanks to the guidance of the Italian soldiers. In just a matter of days, they managed to restore a crucial bridge that allowed for the rapid deployment of supplies and reinforcements to the front lines. This success, achieved through collaboration, became a turning point, highlighting how local knowledge could dramatically improve the speed and effectiveness of Allied military operations. As U.S. engineers and Italian soldiers continued to work side by side, the tactical advantage of their partnership was clear. The Italian soldiers' familiarity with their surroundings gave them insight into areas that American engineers could not have known otherwise. The immediate repairs to infrastructure, particularly to roads and bridges, allowed the Allied forces to push through Italy faster than expected, bypassing German strongholds and keeping the Germans on the defensive. In terms of moral impact, this collaboration represented a moment of human unity in the face of war. It was a realization that despite the harsh realities of previous allegiances, survival and victory depended on working together. The Italian soldiers were not just helping the Allies because they had to, they were contributing to the liberation of their own country. For the engineers, working alongside their former enemies also served as a reminder of the unpredictable nature of war, where alliances could shift quickly and unexpectedly. The men of both sides, once enemies, now found themselves facing a common goal, defeating the Germans and rebuilding a shattered Italy. As the Allied advance through Italy continued, the partnership between American engineers and Italian soldiers proved indispensable. In key operations, from Salerno to Anzio, the collaboration allowed the U.S. engineers to complete vital repairs, reinforcing Allied supply lines and accelerating the Italian liberation. This cooperation, initially born from the harsh realities of war, proved that even the most unlikely alliances could lead to strategic success. The combination of American engineering expertise and Italian knowledge of the land played a pivotal role in the success of the Italian campaign, ensuring the continued momentum of the Allied forces in their quest to defeat Nazi Germany. As the Italian campaign progressed, the cooperation between the Italian soldiers and U.S. engineers became a critical turning point. The initial surprise of the former enemies working together soon turned into a practical necessity, and the results were profound. The collaboration allowed the Allied forces to maintain their momentum as they fought their way north through Italy, and it ensured that vital infrastructure, roads, bridges, and airstrips was quickly repaired or rebuilt. For the Italian soldiers, the partnership with the Americans provided both a chance for redemption and a way forward. Many of these soldiers had been disillusioned by the collapse of Mussolini's fascist regime. Some had fought out of obligation, others out of loyalty to a government that no longer existed. But by working alongside the Allies, they had the opportunity to play a vital role in the reconstruction of their homeland. While their involvement could never fully erase the stigma of their earlier alignment with the Axis powers, it allowed them to contribute to a cause they could believe in: the defeat of the German occupation and the restoration of peace. In the immediate aftermath of their cooperation, many Italian soldiers began to feel a sense of pride in the work they had done. No longer fighting for Mussolini, they were now part of an effort to liberate Italy from Nazi occupation. For many, it was a chance to reclaim their dignity. The Allied engineers often expressed gratitude and admiration for the Italian soldiers' contributions. This was no small gesture. It marked a profound shift in the way former enemies saw one another. No longer viewed solely as collaborators of the fascist regime, the Italian soldiers were now seen as partners in the battle against the Germans. On a larger scale, the Italian contribution had a strategic impact on the course of the war. The Italian resistance movements had been growing in strength in northern Italy, but their efforts often lacked the resources and coordination necessary to challenge the Germans effectively. The co-belligerent army, bolstered by the work of U.S. engineers and the logistical advantages provided by Italian soldiers, began to create a unified front against the Germans. This cooperation ensured that Allied forces would have the necessary infrastructure to continue their advance northward. The Italians, once considered a weak link in the Axis chain, were now playing a crucial role in the Allied victory in Italy. The repair of critical infrastructure, roads, bridges, and airstrips was not just about moving supplies and troops, it was about keeping the momentum of the Allied advance. Operation Avalanche and Operation Shingle, which had been pivotal in the early stages of the campaign, had seen their success largely due to the quick restoration of vital transportation routes. The Italian soldiers had contributed significantly to this, ensuring that the US engineers were able to keep moving forward at a rapid pace. The strategic importance of these efforts cannot be overstated. With each bridge rebuilt, each road cleared, and each airstrip made operational, the Allied forces gained another advantage over the German defences. The Germans, who had originally intended to slow the Allies' progress by destroying key infrastructure, now found that the combined efforts of the Italians and Americans were making these defences irrelevant. The quick repairs were strategic in the sense that they kept the Germans off balance, preventing them from slowing the Allied advance in southern Italy. For the U.S. engineers, the Italian soldiers were not just allies in name, they were a force multiplier. The engineers, accustomed to working alone, now had local experts who could help them navigate unfamiliar terrain, direct them to areas that required immediate attention. The role of the Italian soldiers in these operations helped the engineers to move faster, respond more effectively, and ultimately create a more robust supply network for the advancing Allied forces. Their local knowledge of areas where German defences were weakest or where hidden routes could be used for rapid advancement became indispensable to the success of the Italian campaign. As US forces continued their push northward, the Italian soldiers became increasingly integrated into Allied operations. They were no longer seen as the enemy, but as vital contributors to the military effort. The physical and emotional toll of war had left Italy devastated, but now, thanks to their partnership with the Americans, the Italian soldiers could begin to rebuild both their homeland and their own sense of identity. The soldiers who had once fought under Mussolini's banner were now part of an international effort that would ultimately bring about the liberation of their country. By the time World War II was nearing its end, the cooperation between Italian soldiers and US engineers had left an indelible mark on the Italian campaign. The immediate success of their collaboration ensured that critical infrastructure was repaired, and the Allied forces maintained their momentum across Italy. But the impact of this partnership stretched beyond the battlefield and into the psychological and moral fabric of both the Italian soldiers and the broader Italian population. For the Italian soldiers, the war's end marked a profound shift in identity. Many of them had been conscripted into Mussolini's army, forced to fight for a regime that they had little connection with. But the days of fascism were over, and Italy had been defeated. Working alongside American engineers, who had once been their enemies, allowed these soldiers to reclaim a sense of agency and purpose. No longer fighting for a fascist leader, they now had the opportunity to contribute to rebuilding their country, restoring their dignity, and aligning themselves with the Allied cause. This psychological shift was not without its challenges. The soldiers had faced months, sometimes years, of brutality, not only on the battlefield but also in the deep divisions that had plagued Italy during the war. The notion of being labelled a traitor by their fellow Italians was still a fear for many. In working with the Allies, they risked being branded as collaborators by those who had continued to support Mussolini's regime or who had been part of the Italian resistance. Yet, as the cooperation with the American engineers deepened, many soldiers began to see their contribution to the Allied cause not just as a military necessity, but as a moral victory, a chance to redeem themselves in the eyes of their country and their comrades. Psychologically, the former soldiers began to feel a sense of reconciliation, not just with the Americans, but also with their own past. They had fought against the Allies under fascism, but now they could see themselves as part of the effort to liberate their country from the very forces they had once allied with. By assisting the engineers in rebuilding vital infrastructure, they began to see themselves as contributors to a new Italy, one that would emerge from the ashes of war with a sense of hope and renewal. For the Allied forces, particularly the US engineers, This collaboration was more than just a logistical advantage. It was a reminder that in times of war, the lines between enemy and ally are not always fixed. The success of the Italian campaign was not just a result of superior firepower or tactics, but of the human element, the willingness to put aside differences and work together for a common goal. The U.S. engineers came to see the Italian soldiers not as the enemy, but as fellow soldiers, trying to survive and rebuild after the collapse of Mussolini's regime. On a broad scale, the cooperation between the Italians and the Americans symbolized a shift in Italy's post-war identity. Once a key member of the Axis powers, Italy found itself at a crossroads after its surrender. By working alongside the Americans and helping rebuild the country, Italy was not just fighting to survive, but also to carve out a new place in a post-war world. The Italians' participation in the reconstruction of their homeland helped to foster a sense of national unity in the aftermath of fascism. It also played a crucial role in the development of the new Italian Republic, one that would seek to distance itself from the fascist past and align itself with the Western Allies in the years that followed. The Italian soldiers' contributions to the Allied victory also served as a powerful reminder that, in times of war, the human capacity for adaptation and cooperation can turn former enemies into partners. The willingness of the Italians to join forces with the Americans had far-reaching consequences, not just for military operations but for the very moral fabric of the post-war era. It became a symbol of the broader theme of forgiveness, reconciliation, and rebuilding that would characterize Italy's post-war recovery. The Italians who helped the Allied engineers rebuild their country would go on to help shape a new Italy, one that was free from the shadows of fascism and aligned with the democratic values that emerged in the post-war years. In terms of military strategy, the success of the Italian campaign was also due to the strategic advantages provided by the local knowledge and infrastructure repairs facilitated by the Italians. By the end of 1944, with the Italians now working alongside their former enemies, the Allies had successfully secured much of Italy. This allowed them to push into northern Europe with a stronger logistical base and more efficient routes than they would have had without the collaboration of the Italian soldiers. As the war in Europe drew to a close in 1945, the contributions of the Italian soldiers and US engineers were recognized as integral to the Allied victory in Italy. This partnership, forged out of the desperate realities of war, helped to shape the eventual liberation of Italy and the beginning of its post-war recovery. The story of Italian soldiers working alongside US engineers in the aftermath of Italy's surrender is more than just a tale of military cooperation. It is a profound reflection on the human ability to adapt, reconcile, and rebuild, even in the darkest moments of history. In a war marked by division and ideological conflict, this unlikely alliance between former enemies revealed that, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, collaboration was possible. For the Italian soldiers, many of whom had been conscripted into Mussolini's army, this moment represented a redemption, an opportunity to redefine their role in the war and contribute to the liberation of their own country. It was a chance to shift from the role of enemy combatants to Allied partners, helping rebuild Italy after the devastation wrought by fascism and the German occupation. The transformation from soldiers of the Axis to co-belligerents in the fight against Germany was not just a tactical shift, but an emotional and psychological one, as these men confronted their past, reconciled their actions, and became active participants in their nation's post-war future. For the Americans, the partnership was an unexpected lesson in humanity, a reminder that, despite the brutalities of war, the will to survive and the drive to rebuild could unite former enemies. The US engineers, working side by side with their Italian counterparts, saw beyond the uniforms, beyond the allegiances of the past. They recognized the value of local expertise and the shared goal of defeating a common enemy. What had begun as a pragmatic necessity evolved into a meaningful collaboration, underscoring the power of adaptation and human resilience even amidst the ruins of war. On a broader scale, The cooperation between the Italian soldiers and U.S. engineers marked the beginning of a new Italy, one free from the shackles of fascism. This partnership, though born out of necessity, laid the foundation for a post-war Italy that would move toward democracy and reconstruction. The efforts of these soldiers, who helped rebuild their own country with their former enemies, were not only vital to the military strategy of the Allies, but also to the moral recovery of Italy as a nation. The psychological scars of war could not be erased overnight, but the willingness to work toward a common good, even with former adversaries, helped pave the way for a new Italy, one that would eventually align itself with the Western world and the values of democracy and peace. This story also serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities of war. It illustrates how alliances can shift, how ideologies can collapse, and how the bonds of humanity can be forged even in the most unlikely circumstances. War is often seen as a time of division, where lines are drawn between friends and enemies. Yet, this partnership between the Italian soldiers and U.S. engineers proves that the ability to rebuild, whether physically or morally, can be found even in the ruins of war. As the Allied forces pushed through Italy and eventually defeated the German forces, they left behind a legacy not only of military victory, but also of human connection, an unexpected moment of cooperation between two peoples who had once been on opposite sides. It is a testament to the ability of ordinary men, in the face of extraordinary circumstances, to overcome their differences, work together, and contribute to the reconstruction of a war-torn world. The collaboration between Italian soldiers and U.S. engineers in World War II is a story that goes beyond the battlefield. It is a reflection of the human spirit, the desire to survive, and the willingness to build something better from the destruction of war. It reminds us that, even in the darkest moments of history, there is always the potential for rebirth, for hope, and for reconciliation.